My mom used my thumbprint while I slept to steal $88,000 from my account. I got furious and the morning of March 14th, 2021, I woke up to 47 missed calls. Not from friends. Not from a spam number. From my own bank. I remember the exact feeling. That cold, hollow drop somewhere in your chest when you already know, before you even unlock your phone, that something is wrong. That something is gone. I sat up in my bed in that small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, still half asleep, still in the clothes I'd worn the night before, and I opened the Bank of America app. The number I saw made my vision blur. $88,000. Transferred.
Gone.
In 3 separate transactions between 2:14 a.m. and 4:09 a.m. While I was sleeping 8 feet away from the door. I didn't scream. I didn't even move for about 30 seconds. I just sat there, reading the number over and over, the way you reread a text when the words don't make sense. The app showed the authentication method clearly. Biometric. Fingerprint confirmed. My fingerprint. The account wasn't hacked. No breach. No fraud from overseas. The transactions were approved the old-fashioned way, with my actual thumb pressed against a phone screen, in the middle of the night, while I was unconscious. There was only one person in that apartment with me that night. And when I walked out of my bedroom and into the kitchen, she was already awake, sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, looking out the window like it was any other morning. My mother looked up at me, and she didn't say a word. What happened next, what I discovered, what I did, and what it eventually cost her, is a story I never planned to tell publicly. But I think some of you need to hear it. Because the number isn't what destroyed me. It was who did it. Let me take you back a little further. To understand what happened on March 14th, you need to understand the life that led up to it. You need to understand a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, a place I had grown up calling home, then escaped, then somehow found myself returning to at 29 years old like the world had folded me back into a shape I thought I'd outgrown. It was the winter of 2020. The pandemic had just dismantled everything with a casualness that still stuns me when I think about it. Restaurants closed. The logistics company I had been contracting for slashed 50% of its remote workforce in a single Tuesday afternoon email. I had a lease I couldn't afford alone, a car payment, and student loan deferrals that weren't going to last forever. So, I did what millions of people quietly did that year. I went home. My mother, Sandra, had lived in that apartment for 11 years. It was neat, orderly. Her plants were always watered, and her kitchen always smelled like something simmering on the stove. She was 61 years old, recently retired from a 23-year career as a medical billing specialist, and living, as far as I knew, comfortably on her pension and the small rental income she collected from a property my late uncle had left her in his will. The arrangement between us was simple. I paid $600 a month toward utilities and groceries. I took the smaller room. I kept my savings account separate, private, and password protected on a phone that never left my possession. Or so I thought. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that my mother had been watching for months. Not out of malice, at first. That's the part that's hardest to reconcile. She knew my phone password from a day in November when I'd asked her to silence it while I was in the shower. She had seen me open the bank app once at the kitchen table. She had made a mental note of which bank it was. And she had been carrying a debt I knew absolutely nothing about, a debt that had been growing in the dark, the way the worst kinds of problems do, quietly and patiently, until the weight of it became unbearable. But none of that was visible that winter. The apartment was warm. Dinner was on the table. And I was grateful, honestly, to not be drowning alone. That's the thing about betrayal inside a family. It doesn't announce itself. It wears the face of something comfortable. When I eventually told people what had happened, weeks later, after the shock had dulled enough for me to form sentences about it, the responses were not what I expected. Some were kind. A few friends sat with me in that kind of stunned silence that means they don't know what to say, and somehow that was the most comforting reaction of all. My coworker Marcus, who I'd reconnected with after finding a new remote job, just exhaled slowly and said, "Man,
I'm sorry."
That's something you don't recover from easily. But a lot of people, more than I want to admit, said something else entirely. My cousin Terrell, who had always had strong opinions about family loyalty, told me flat out that I needed to drop it. "That's your mother," he said, like those two words were supposed to close the conversation. "You're going to drag your own mother through the legal system over money? What does that say about you?" He said it like the shame was mine to carry. My Aunt Diane, my mother's older sister, called me on a Sunday morning and spent 45 minutes explaining that Sandra had been under stress I didn't understand, that she had always sacrificed for me, that the money could be worked out quietly within the family without involving courts or police. "You're going to ruin her life," she said. "Is that really what you want? Is that the kind of son you are?" Online, because I made the mistake of posting something vague on a forum during a weak moment, the responses were even colder. "You left your phone accessible in someone else's house. That's on you." One comment got 43 upvotes. "People who take their own mothers to court are the definition of ungrateful." Another one said that I must have been doing something shady to have that kind of money saved in the first place, and that maybe I should examine why my first instinct was to punish a 61-year-old woman. What nobody acknowledged, not Terrell, not Aunt Diane, not the strangers on the internet, was the actual number. $88,000. That wasn't spare change borrowed in a tight month. That wasn't a misunderstanding about shared finances. That was 7 years of working nights and weekends, of skipping vacations, of eating the same 4 meals on rotation because I was too focused to care about variety. That was a down payment on a future I had built in the dark, quietly, alone. And what none of them knew yet, what I was only beginning to piece together myself, was exactly where that money had gone. Because the answer to that question changed everything. It made the situation simultaneously more understandable and more devastating. And it was the answer to that question that would ultimately determine what I chose to do next. My name is Daniel Reeves. And I want to be clear about something before I continue. I am not, and have never been, a dramatic person. I didn't grow up telling stories about myself. I was the quiet kid in the back of the classroom in Linden, Columbus, the one who finished his work early and spent the rest of class reading library books about how things were built. Bridges, engines, supply chains. I was fascinated by systems, by the way large, complicated things could be understood if you just broke them down far enough. My father left when I was 11. Not dramatically, he just sort of receded. Phone calls became monthly, then occasional, then a card at Christmas with a sign name and no message. My mother worked doubles at the hospital billing department and came home smelling like coffee and printer paper. I learned to cook simple things because I was often home before she was. I learned to manage a household budget because she would sometimes leave me an envelope with grocery money and a list, and I would always come home with change. I was, by most definitions, unremarkable. I didn't play sports. I wasn't popular. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State, studied supply chain management, graduated in 2014, and spent the next 6 years taking every contract job I could find, often 2 at a time, methodically building savings the way some people collect stamps. Not obsessively, just consistently, month after month. Because I had learned early that the only thing standing between you and a disaster was the distance you'd put between yourself and zero. By March 2021, I had $88,400 in a Bank of America savings account. I had a rough plan to use it as a down payment on a duplex, live in one unit, rent the other, build something that would eventually not require me to trade hours for dollars. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of story people tell at parties. But it was mine. And what nobody around me had ever fully appreciated, what even my mother seemed not to understand about me, was how seriously I took it. There was something else about me, though. Something that would matter more than any of them expected. A quiet habit I developed years before, almost by accident, that would become the foundation of everything that followed. In the spring of 2016, I took a job with a financial logistics company in Cincinnati, a 12-month contract that had me auditing transaction records for discrepancies between warehousing costs and accounts payable. It was deeply boring work on the surface. Rows and rows of spreadsheets. Numbers that were supposed to match other numbers. And yet, about 3 months in, I found something. A pattern of small, recurring transfers, each one under $500, that had been happening for 2.5 years, always on the third Thursday of the month. always at 11:47 p.m., always to an account that should have been dormant. The company's internal auditors had missed it entirely. The fraud detection software had been calibrated for large, unusual withdrawals, not for small, precisely timed, rhythmic ones. By the time I flagged it, just over $180,000 had been quietly moved. The manager who reviewed my finding couldn't fully explain how I had caught it when the automated systems hadn't. I didn't have a great answer at the time, but I thought about it afterward for years and I eventually understood. I had looked at the records the way I'd always looked at problems, not for what was there, but for what shouldn't be. Not for the obvious anomaly, but for the pattern inside the ordinary. I spent the next 2 years learning more about financial forensics and digital transaction trails in my spare time. Not formally, I never enrolled in a course. I read case studies. I followed legal blogs about wire fraud and digital authentication law. A former federal financial investigator named Raymond Cho had published a series of long-form articles on a now-defunct website called AuditMind, and I must have read each one 3 or 4 times. He wrote about the way digital banking authentication, fingerprint, facial recognition, PIN, creates a legal paper trail that is actually far more detailed than most people realize. Every authentication event is logged with a timestamp, a device identifier, a location ping, and in many cases, a gyroscope and accelerometer reading from the moment of approval. In short, the phone knows the difference between a finger pressing it while the hand is relaxed and motionless, the posture of a sleeping person, and a finger pressing it while the hand is active and engaged. I filed all of this away. It was interesting to me the way a lot of things were interesting to me, not because I planned to use it, but because understanding how systems worked was simply how I moved through the world. On the morning of March 14, 2021, standing in my mother's kitchen with 47 missed calls and a balance of $312, I remembered everything I had ever read about that paper trail. And I understood, with a stillness that surprised even me, that I was not helpless. The real question wasn't whether I could prove what had happened. I already knew I could. The real question, the one that would take weeks to answer, was what I was actually going to do about it. And that question was much harder. Because the person who had taken everything from me had also, at various points in my life, given me everything. The money hadn't simply vanished into the air. Over the following 4 days, I pieced together where it had gone, and the picture that emerged was not what I had initially imagined. The first transfer, for $31,000, had gone to a company called Meridian Property Solutions, LLC, registered in the state of Georgia. The second, for $22,500, had gone to an individual, a name I didn't recognize, by a wire transfer. The third, for $34,500, had been sent to a Western Union intermediary account, which was significantly harder to trace. I found this out not by calling the bank, though I did that too, but by doing something most people don't think to do. I sat down with every piece of paper in the apartment that I could find. Old mail, folders in the hall closet, a shoebox on the top shelf of the pantry that my mother had not expected me to ever open. What I found inside that box was 3 years of a story she had never told me. In 2018, my mother had invested $40,000, nearly everything she had saved from her pension, into a real estate partnership. The man who had pitched it to her was named Gerald Watts. He was 56, well-dressed, and had been introduced to her through her church. He had shown her property listings, LLC documents, a glossy brochure, and projections showing a 22% annual return. By mid-2019, Sandra had received 2 quarterly disbursements, each one for $1,800. She believed in it completely. By late 2019, Gerald Watts was unreachable. The LLC had been dissolved. The properties listed in the brochure were either not owned by the partnership or had already been resold to unaffiliated parties. My mother had been defrauded. Her entire initial investment was gone. But that wasn't all of it. In the fog of that loss, she had turned to a private lending company, the kind that operates at the fringes of legitimacy, with interest rates that a reasonable person would never agree to unless they were desperate. She had borrowed $28,000 to try to recover her losses through a second real estate opportunity, also through someone from her church circle. That one failed too. By January 2021, she owed the lending company $41,000 in principal plus accumulated interest. They had begun calling her daily. She had received a formal demand letter in February. The transfers from my account were not random. They were targeted. The $31,000 to Meridian Property Solutions was her attempt to buy into one final deal, the one she had convinced herself would fix everything. The $22,500 was a partial payment to the private lender to stop the calls. The $34,500 to the Western Union intermediary was a payment she'd been pressured into making to someone she believed could recover her original $40,000, a recovery scammer running a second con on top of the first. In 4 months, my mother had been victimized 3 different ways. And her solution, the one she arrived at somewhere around 2 a.m. on March 14th, had been to victimize me. I am not telling you this to excuse what she did. I'm telling you this because the truth was more complicated than theft. And complicated truths are harder to act on than simple ones. For several days, I did nothing but read those documents and sit with the weight of what I now knew. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, the plan began to form. Here is something almost nobody knows about biometric bank fraud. The burden of proof is not where most people think it is. When a bank fraud claim is filed, the default assumption is that the account holder made the transaction because biometric authentication was used. The bank's responsibility is largely discharged at that point. What they don't tell you, what is buried in the fine print of most major bank account agreements, is that this presumption can be challenged. And the standard for challenging it is lower than you'd expect, provided you know what evidence to ask for. I called Bank of America on March 17th, 3 days after the incident. I did not immediately file a fraud claim. I asked, instead, to speak with someone in the escalations department, and I asked a very specific question. I asked whether the bank retained accelerometer and gyroscope data from authentication events on mobile devices where those sensors were active at the time of login. The representative was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she would need to transfer me. The escalations officer I reached, a woman named Diane, told me carefully that the bank retained certain device telemetry data for a period of up to 90 days on accounts flagged for review. She could not confirm what specific data points were captured. What she did tell me, and I believe she told me this because she understood the situation and was trying to be helpful within the limits of her role, was that a formal fraud claim opened within the retention window would preserve that data for potential legal proceedings. I filed the claim that afternoon. What I did not do was call the police yet. Not because I was protecting my mother, though I was wrestling with that constantly, but because I had learned enough to know that the sequence of actions mattered. Filing the civil claim first, preserving the evidentiary trail, giving myself time to understand exactly what had happened to Sandra and by whom, all of that had to come before anything else. If I called the police impulsively before I had the full picture, I might close doors I needed to keep open. The people who had taken advantage of my mother were still out there. And that changed the calculation entirely. The next 6 weeks were the most methodical of my life. I started by doing something that felt almost clinical given the circumstances. I sat down with my mother, and I asked her to tell me everything. Not angrily, not with accusations. I laid the shoebox on the table between us. I told her what I had found, what I had filed, and what I knew. And then I waited. She cried for a long time before she spoke. And when she finally did, over the course of 2 long evenings and 1 afternoon, the full picture came out. Names. Dates. Phone numbers she still had saved in her contacts. Text messages from Gerald Watts that she hadn't deleted because she kept hoping they would eventually prove useful. A notebook where she had written down every conversation with the lending company, dates, representative names, what was said. She was meticulous, my mother. Even in her most panicked decisions, she kept records. I suppose she'd learned that from 23 years in medical billing. I made copies of everything. Then I contacted a consumer fraud attorney named Patricia Olo, whose name I found through an Ohio State bar referral. I paid her a $500 consultation fee, money I borrowed from Marcus, and spent 90 minutes walking her through the entire situation. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said 3 things. First, that the biometric fraud claim against Bank of America had a reasonable chance of partial recovery, potentially 60 to 70% of the transferred amount, if the telemetry data supported my account of the events. Second, that Gerald Watts and the recovery scammer were potentially chargeable under Ohio wire fraud statutes and possibly federal law, depending on how they had communicated with my mother. Third, that the private lending company, depending on its interest rate structure and licensing, might be operating in violation of Ohio's usury laws. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted to pursue all three simultaneously. She told me that was going to be expensive and slow, and that I needed to be prepared for both of those things. I told her I had time. Over the following weeks, Patricia filed the formal fraud dispute with Bank of America, citing the telemetry data and the circumstances of the authentication. She filed a complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section regarding Gerald Watts and the recovery scammer, attaching the documents from my mother's shoebox. She sent a formal demand letter to the private lending company, citing potential violations of the Ohio Consumer Installment Loan Act and requesting an immediate freeze on interest accrual. Simultaneously, I was doing my own work. I found Gerald Watts. Not in person, on paper. He had operated under 3 different LLC names in 4 different states over 11 years. The Ohio AG complaint I had filed was not the first. I found 2 prior complaints in Georgia and 1 in Tennessee, neither of which had resulted in prosecution. I compiled everything into a 12-page document and submitted it to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, as a supplement to the state filing. Every evening I came home, made dinner, and sat across from my mother at the table. We didn't talk about the case. We talked about other things, her plants, the neighborhood, old memories. It was strange and uncomfortable and, in some ways, the most honest period of our relationship. There was nothing left to hide from each other. And in that strange, stripped-down way, we found something that resembled honesty. But I wasn't done. Not even close. 8 weeks after I filed, Bank of America sent a letter. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter, still in my work shirt, and read it twice before I let myself understand what it said. The bank had reviewed the telemetry data associated with the 3 authentication events and had determined that the motion profile during the second and third transactions, totaling $57,000, was inconsistent with standard active use patterns. Based on this finding, and in light of the documentation provided, they were restoring $57,000 to my account pending a final review period of 15 business days. Not all of it. Not yet. But $57,000 out of $88,000. Real money. Recoverable money. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the letter for a while. My mother was in the living room watching television. I could hear the faint sound of the show she always watched at that hour, some quiet procedural drama she'd been following for years. I thought about walking in and telling her. I thought about what her face would look like. I thought about the shoebox in the closet, and the notebook full of dates and names, and the 2 evenings she had spent telling me the truth. I didn't go in. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the folder I had been building since March 17th. There was still the other $31,000. And there were still 3 people who had taken far more than $88,000 when you counted what they had taken from my mother long before I ever got involved. The bank result was a confirmation that the approach was working. But it was not the victory. Not yet. Patricia called me 2 days later with a second piece of news. The lending company had responded to her demand letter. They were disputing the usury claim, but they had agreed, under legal pressure, to freeze interest accrual while the matter was reviewed. My mother's debt was no longer growing. That's real, Patricia said. That's something to build on. The full picture took 14 months to resolve. In May 2021, the Ohio Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into Gerald Watts, partly on the strength of the multi-state complaint package I had helped build. The IC3 submission had drawn federal attention. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Atlanta had been tracking a similar pattern in Georgia and recognized the overlap immediately. In September 2021, Gerald Watts was charged federally with wire fraud and investment advisor fraud across 4 states. 19 victims were identified. The total amount defrauded exceeded $2 million. My mother's name was on the victim list. The recovery process in federal fraud cases is slow and partial, but it is real. By May 2022, Through the federal restitution process, my mother received $19,400, approximately 48% of her original investment loss. It wasn't everything. It never is. But it was something that shouldn't have been possible according to everyone who had told me to let it go. Bank of America, after the final review period, restored the full $57,000 initially offered and, following Patricia's second challenge supported by additional telemetry analysis from an independent digital forensics consultant she brought in, agreed to restore the remaining $31,000 as well. On June 2, 2022, 15 months after I had sat in my bed staring at a nearly empty account, the full $88,000 was back. Every dollar. The private lending company, under continued legal pressure and a formal complaint to the Ohio Division of Financial Institutions, agreed to a negotiated settlement. My mother's remaining debt of approximately $31,000 was reduced to $9,500, which she was given 18 months to pay without additional interest. A manageable number, one she could actually handle. The total financial recovery across all three streams, the bank restoration, the federal restitution, and the lending settlement, amounted to more than I had originally lost. Not by much, but more. Cousin Terrell called me when he heard. He asked how I'd done it. I told him I had paid attention to things other people had ignored, and I had not let anyone tell me that being patient was the same thing as giving up. The people who had told me to drop it went quiet. Not all at once, but gradually, in the way that people recalibrate when the thing they predicted would happen did not. Terrell stopped making comments about family loyalty. He actually called me once, a few months after the bank restoration was finalized, and spent 20 minutes asking careful questions about how the biometric data had worked in the fraud dispute. He had a situation with a business partner, he said. He didn't say much else, but I understood. He was asking for help from the person he had dismissed. Aunt Diane sent a text message in August 2022 that simply said she was glad things had worked out and that Sandra seemed better. She did not apologize, but she didn't need to. I had not pursued any of this looking for apologies. The forum where strangers had told me I was ungrateful, I never posted there again. But I did read, sometime in early 2023, that someone had started a thread about digital banking fraud and whether biometric authentication created a false sense of security for account holders. The thread was long and detailed, and the consensus, slowly, was that the presumption of authorization based on biometric data was being challenged with increasing success in courts and banking disputes. Some commenter had linked to a legal blog post by Patricia Olo about the telemetry evidence standards she had helped establish in our case. The post had been read over 40,000 times. I did not comment, but I read every reply. The financial forensics consultant Patricia had brought in a man named Victor Shin, who had worked for 12 years as a fraud examiner for a major bank before going independent, told me, when we debriefed after the case closed, that our case had contributed to an internal policy review at two major banking institutions. The telemetry data had been collected all along. What our case had established was that a client's counsel could request it and that it carried evidentiary weight in disputes. You changed something, Victor said. Small, but real. I didn't feel heroic about it. I felt tired and grateful, and mostly strange about the fact that the biggest challenge hadn't been the bank or the law or the three criminals who had emptied my mother's life before she ever touched my phone. The biggest challenge had been continuing to see my mother clearly, not just as the person who had betrayed me, but as the person who had been broken first. By the fall of 2023, my life looked different in ways I hadn't fully planned. The duplex I had originally planned to buy in 2021, the one the stolen money was supposed to fund, I purchased in March 2022, right as the restoration was finalizing. It was a 2-unit property in Westerville, about 18 miles north of Columbus. Not glamorous. Built in 1987, needed fresh paint and new appliances in both units. I did most of the work myself on weekends, which is how I learned that I was substantially better at understanding building systems than actually fixing them, and that YouTube tutorials have an alarming tolerance for letting you get halfway through a plumbing job before revealing the part that requires a professional. I rented the first unit to a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn, who paid on time every month and brought me homemade bread at Christmas. I lived in the second unit for 14 months while I saved enough for a second property, a single-family home in Gahanna that I bought in May 2023 and converted to a rental within 60 days. 2 properties. Real, physical assets. Income that arrived regardless of whether I was at a desk. None of it would have happened on the original timeline without the restoration. I know that. The theft and the recovery accelerated something, forced a confrontation with the systems I had been trusting passively, and turned me into someone who understood those systems in a much more active way. My mother moved out of the Columbus apartment in the spring of 2022. Not because I pushed her to. She found a subsidized senior housing complex in Clintonville with a community garden and a bridge club and what she described as, finally, neighbors who mind their own business. She seemed lighter there. She had weekly therapy, something the victim's advocacy coordinator from the federal case had connected her to. She talked about Gerald Watts differently over time. Less like a monster who had targeted her, more like a symptom of something she had needed to understand about how she made decisions when she was afraid. I visited her most Sundays. We ate lunch. We talked about the properties, about her garden, about the news. We did not talk about March 14, 2021 very often. But we also didn't pretend it hadn't happened. It was like a scar that we both knew was there and had silently agreed was a part of us, without being the definition of us. She paid back the $9,500 settlement in 12 months instead of 18. She told me this on a Sunday in January 2023, over soup. I told her I was proud of her. She looked at her bowl for a moment and then said, very quietly, that she knew she didn't deserve that. I told her she had done the work anyway, which was what mattered. In early 2024, a woman named Keisha found me through the consumer advocacy forum I had quietly started contributing to, a small, earnest corner of the internet where people dealing with banking fraud and predatory lending could share strategies and resources. She was 31 years old and had recently discovered that her stepfather had been accessing her mobile banking app through her sister's device, which had been added to her account as an authorized device years earlier and never removed. He had taken $14,000. Her bank had initially told her that because the device was authorized, there was no fraud claim to file. I spent 3 evenings helping Keisha understand the options she hadn't been told about. I connected her with Patricia Olo, who by then had handled 7 cases with similar digital authentication elements. I walked her through what documents to gather, what to ask for, and what not to say until she had legal representation. Her case resolved in 4 months. Full recovery. She sent me a message afterward that I still think about sometimes. She said, "The bank told me I had no options. You told me what questions to ask. That's the difference." That's exactly it. That's the whole thing distilled. It's not that the systems are always in your favor. They're frequently not. It's that most of the time, when people feel powerless, it's because they don't know what questions to ask. They don't know that the data exists, that it can be requested, that the presumptions they've been handed are not immovable, that patience and precision can accomplish things that panic never will. I passed along to Keisha everything I had kept. The Raymond Cho articles. My case notes. Victor Shun's contact information. Patricia's fee schedule and her practice areas. A document I had written for myself, a kind of personal playbook that laid out the sequence of actions and the reasoning behind each one. I told her to use it and add to it and give it to the next person who needed it. Knowledge passed forward isn't lost. It compounds. The same way good savings do. I have thought many times about what happened on March 14, 2021 and what it cost me and what it taught me, and I keep arriving at the same place. We are all, in some way, both the person who was betrayed and the person who was desperate. My mother was not a villain. She was a woman who had been hurt, and then hurt again, and then had made a terrible decision in the middle of the night when the fear became bigger than her judgment. I was not a hero. I was a person who had paid attention to the right things for years without knowing why, and who found, in the worst moment of his adult life, that the accumulation of quiet knowledge was worth more than he had understood. The $88,000 came back. But more than that came back with it. A clearer understanding of the systems that govern our money and our trust. A relationship with my mother that was rebuilt on something more honest than silence. A habit of passing forward what I had learned, because the best thing you can do with an edge is share it. The people who told me to let it go were not wrong to love their family. They were wrong to assume that love and accountability are opposites. Sometimes demanding the truth is the most loving thing you can do. Do not assume you have no options. Do not assume that because something is hard to challenge, it cannot be challenged. Ask the question. Request the data. Find the person who knows what you don't know yet. Stay methodical when the world wants you to be emotional. The morning of March 14th, 2021, I woke up with nothing in an account I had spent 7 years building. By June 2nd, 2022, it was all back. The difference between those two dates was 14 months of not giving up and one very specific habit. I paid attention to things that other people had decided weren't worth understanding. That habit is free, and no one can take it while you sleep.